Welcome to The Debate, a regular series produced by UNICEF's Office of Research, where key issues affecting the world's children are discussed by global experts. In this edition, climate change and children. From droughts to flash floods, failing crops and increased disease, the Earth's climate is changing. Today, we look at the science, the politics, the impact and the next generation. My name is Maria Ramos, and joining me in our London studios today are the Head of Climate Change at ODI, Dr. Tom Mitchell, and Professor Saleem Ul Huq, the Senior Fellow in the Climate Change Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And joining us all the way from Nigeria is Miss Esther Agbarakwe, the Head of the Nigerian Youth Climate Coalition. Now, let's get up to speed with what's happening with climate change. What is the latest and how bad is it going to get? Dr. Ul Huq.
Well, the latest in the last few days or weeks is the extent of ice melt in the North Pole and the polar regions, which is way more than we had expected. And over the last 20 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been producing the scientific evidence on climate change, when they made predictions 20 years ago, they expected a band of potential impacts. Everything we're seeing in the last 20 years is well above that band of potential impacts. So things are much worse than were predicted. And so we're in a bad situation right now.
And how much worse are they going to get, Dr. Mitchell?
Well, I think we're seeing already that there are a number of extreme events that are beyond what we've experienced before. And the scientists are telling us now that they can see that climate change is causing some of those extreme events. This is just the tip of the iceberg. You know, the future is going to be extremes beyond our imagination.
Now, is there real potential for climate change to undo all the progress that has taken place in development, such as disease and hunger reduction?
Yeah, well, no, of course, development progress has been really strong in the last 20 years. We've seen increasing security, increasing human health, real improvements to people's living conditions. But now we're really seeing a set of threats to that from climate change. Just think about food prices. Food prices have gone up drastically recently as a result of extreme events in areas producing agriculture. And then, you know, the impact of that is that we've got increasing malnutrition in some areas. We've got problems with changing patterns of disease. We've got sea level rise causing real problems with salt intrusion into our soils, meaning we can't grow more. And this is likely to get worse. And certainly the investments that we've made, the progress that we've made is really under threat in the next 10 or 20 years.
Dr. Huq, any thoughts on this?
Well, I certainly agree with that. I think one of the biggest problems for developing countries in particular, who have invested so much in trying to make progress over the last 2 decades, that climate change will reverse much of that, particularly in some of the poorest countries in the world, the least developed countries, for example, which are nearly 50 of the poorest countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and some in Asia, are facing major constraints on the development pathway that they have.
Now, Esther, I'd like to put that question to you.
Right now, I'm seeing it in the Nigerian floods that we're currently having. I saw other floods happening in West Africa. Imagine families have already tried to bring up themselves away from poverty and now been taken back deeper than where they were before. Disease, food security issues, even security issues. People will be migrating from these affected areas to urban centers, and this is going to cause probably conflicts because there's a lot of people moving. And these are things that we don't want to happen. You know, we've been fighting to make sure that we have a more sustainable environment where people can relate to each other, live happily, you know, take themselves away from poverty. But now they're going backward, even go worse than they were before.
Thank you. Now, talk to me about developing countries. Which ones are taking the lead in tackling climate change, and what exactly are they doing?
Well, I would characterize the least developed countries as probably being the most proactive on this issue. They've all carried out assessments of climate change impacts and national adaptation plans, which many of them are now implementing. I'll give you an example of the country I'm most familiar with, where I come from in Bangladesh. They have one of the most proactive climate change strategies and action plans. And in fact, the government of Bangladesh has already invested in the order of $300 million in implementing it. So they're not waiting for the rest of the world to come to their rescue. They're doing what they can themselves.
Now, I'd like to ask Dr. Mitchell, how do you distribute responsibility with these different countries?
Well, of course, you know, we want to make sure that the countries that have contributed most to the problem do the most. So we've got rich countries who've historically emitted a lot of greenhouse gases, should be taking responsibility. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that they're not taking the responsibility that they should. So developing countries, in feeling the impacts already, have taken it upon themselves to do this. It's their very survival, so they're already adapting to the impacts of climate change. And importantly, they're taking the lead in many cases in reducing greenhouse gases. They see that there's an economic benefit, they see it's good for jobs, good for health, and they're investing in renewable energies, new ways to generate electricity, simply because they know it's important for their survival.
I'd like to speak to you, Ms. Agbarakwe. Now, it's been said that this generation has failed to reduce climate change and that we need a new generation to take the lead. But of course, in most key regions, children's voices can't be heard. Can this change?
Yes, indeed. In most key regions, young children's voices are not heard. Why? Because sometimes they feel that young people have nothing to contribute, but this is not true. Like in where I come from in Africa, sometimes the elders feel that they have the monopoly of knowledge in issues like this. But right now, we're seeing a lot of young people and children themselves coming out to tell the world how climate is impacting them. I think with technology that we have now, with social media and other things that we have in our hand, we're going to use that to hold government accountable, to let them know that children should be considered as key moral stakeholders in the discussion on climate change, because it's affecting them, it's affecting them now, will affect them tomorrow, and will affect them in the years to come.
What if children's voices aren't heard? I'll ask you first, Dr. Ul Huq.
Well, we aren't hearing him at the moment. Unfortunately, our political leaders are not giving this the attention it deserves. And hopefully, the next generation coming forward will be able to raise their voices and either get the attention of the leaders we have or remove the leaders we have and get new ones that are going to respond to the magnitude of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, within the development community, there's a lot of emphasis on adaptation and resilience with a focus on youth. Is this asking too much of the next generation?
Well, whether it's asking too much or not, there's nothing that we can do about it, because we certainly are leaving a legacy of a problem on their shoulders. And the sooner they are able to understand it and take actions to deal with it, the better for all of us. And hopefully make us realize, the adults of this generation, that we need to take action as well, and we don't have time to lose. But it's certainly something that is of concern to youth and children in a much bigger way than most other problems.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Mitchell, shouldn't mitigation be the #1 priority for absolutely everybody?
Well, yes, it should be the priority for everybody, but unfortunately, as it isn't, we've also got to consider the ways in which we adapt to the impacts of climate change. And the longer that we go on at not making enough progress on mitigation, the more adaptation that we need to do, and the more there is the chance of loss and damage. We'll just simply be losing areas and territories as the sea level rises. So mitigation has to be the #1 priority, and children and youth have got to ask their political leaders, particularly those in the developed world, to take the major steps that we need now to try and avoid dangerous climate change.
Let's talk about the financing, let's talk money. Who pays? In the middle of a financial crisis, who resources the changes and the protection measures that need to be put in place?
Well, we have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which actually sets out the basis for who pays. And it simply says that those who are polluting, those who have caused the problem, should be paying for the damages that we're seeing. And it's written down there in black and white. But the problem that we've got at the moment is that simply not enough money is going into tackling climate change, and not enough money is being transferred to developing countries to help them deal with the problem. What we're seeing is that the richer countries say that they're going to make the pledges, give the money, but it doesn't end up in the right bank accounts. Simply there's breakdowns in the system here at the moment. And certainly from the data that we're seeing, less than 1% of the total money pledged to deal with climate change in developing countries is actually reaching people on the ground, and that's got to change.
And how big a problem is this for both money for aid and for climate change coming from the same pot?
Well, it's a very big problem from the developing countries' point of view, because as Thomas said, in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, the money for climate change is supposed to be new and additional to development assistance. But as we are seeing developed countries pledge money, they are counting both development assistance and climate change money as fulfilling the same dollar, fulfilling both tasks, which is something that developing countries feel is against the agreement that they had reached.
Now tell me, Dr. Huq, are there innovative examples of adaptation and the need to mitigate climate change that have been brought to the world of development?
On the mitigation side as well, many of the developing countries have taken major efforts at reducing emissions. The Maldives, for example, has pledged to go carbon neutral by 2020. So has Costa Rica. So these are countries whose emissions aren't very big. They're not going to affect the problem, but they're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and they're asking everybody else to do the same.
Dr. Mitchell, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, as Dr. Huq says, that developing countries are taking the lead. What we're seeing is that actually developing country governments don't see a big difference between their future development pathway and how they deal with climate change. They can come together in what we're calling climate compatible development. The important thing is that you can both achieve development progress, build resilience to climate change, and mitigate greenhouse gases at the same time. There are things that work. We are seeing things that work. The problem is at the moment we're just not seeing the progress quite quickly enough, but certainly the richer countries could take a lead from some of the action that Dr. Huq outlines in developing countries.
And Ms. Agbarakwe, any thoughts on this?
Where did they start from, you know? You see mothers trying to save their children from flood. Their house is destroyed. Their property is gone. Where did they start from? And what capacity do they have, you know, to adapt and change that? So for me, what I've seen is that adaptation now is a priority, and we need to find innovative ways of you know, producing adaptation strategies that are easily, you know, mainstream from local communities that are mostly affected than the urban areas in our country. So, for me, I want to see our focus in these developing countries in times like this should be adaptation rather than mitigation.
To cut in there, you know, we know that adaptation is absolutely vital. It's a clear and present danger, climate change. We need to do something about it. And Ms. Agbarakwe's example there is, you know, shows us how important it is. But, you know, it's important also to recognise that actually the climate change science is showing us that things are so bad that everybody really needs to chip in to help with avoiding the problem. And what we're seeing is even if developing countries you know, should not consider mitigating greenhouse gases in the name of climate change, they should consider mitigating greenhouse gases as a business opportunity. Yeah. You know, they're seeing new investment coming in to support renewable energies, and it's a great opportunity for them to both grow and grow in a way that is green. And so there is an important need to balance the adaptation components, but also the components that will lead to a greener form of economic growth and help in reducing climate change at the same time.
I see you nodding there. Do you want anything you'd like to add?
For some time now, we used to compartmentalize the mitigation issue with the rich countries and the adaptation with the poor countries. Increasingly, we're seeing that that's a false dichotomy. Everybody's going to have to mitigate and everybody's going to have to adapt. Some people will need to adapt first and others later, the poor first and rich later. But everybody's going to mitigate because a ton of carbon emitted from a poor country or a rich country makes the same impact on global warming. It doesn't really matter where it comes from.
You know, climate change is a political issue and very often just, you know, distorts the environmental and social discussions. So how do we move beyond the politics? I'd like to ask you, Dr. Mitchell.
Well, I think people all around the world in their communities are seeing that they have to act. You know, the financial pressures that they're seeing coming as a result of climate change means that it hits them in the pocket, you know, in a richer world as well. And so people feel as if they can act. They can recycle, they can change their patterns of working to reduce greenhouse gases or to adapt to climate change. And so that takes it to a certain out of the political sphere and into the domestic sphere. But the important thing is that that there is a pressure to get the political leaders to act, because it's only at that kind of international political level can we really drive through the progress needed.
Ms. Agbarakwe, how do you think we can move beyond the politics?
I think one way what we could do is this. We bring the stories, these people, the survivors of impact of climate change to the forefront. Let them hear their stories, the story of struggle, the story of change, and the story of need to make something more better for them. Because beyond being just a political issue, it's a development issue. And politicians want to show something for why we voted them in. they won't want to show that people have died, people have been displaced, missing. They want to show something really positive. So I think when they see the stories from these people impacted by climate change and those also finding solutions to this problem, I think that's going to change a lot of things around.
Now, my last question, and I'd like to start with you, Ms. Agbarakwe. What are the one or two big issues where we all need to take action right now? And what is that action?
I mean, coming from my own community, what we need to do is educate people on climate change. That's the first thing we need to do. Most people don't know about climate change. Secondly, we need to change the way we live. We need to change the way we live. Whatever we do in our world, we have to consider the environment. What impact does it have on the environment? We have to practice what we do preach. Beyond educating people about the issue and inspire them to take action, you yourself need to take action as well. Charity begins at home, and then we have to practice what we do. I think for me, from where I'm coming from, education first, and then secondly, we have to practice what we preach.
My question to studio, Dr. Huq, the one or two big issues.
Well, I would say that the climate change problem and therefore its solution brings together the 6 billion people on the planet in a way that no other problem does, because it affects everybody. It's a planetary scale problem. And therefore, each of us, by virtue of the food we eat, the way we live, the transport we have, are part of the problem. We have a carbon footprint. We are producing emissions of greenhouse gases. But they vary by orders of magnitude. The rich produce much more. This is rich people in rich countries as well as rich people in poor countries, and the poor much less, but they still have a carbon footprint. And at the same time, there are people on the planet that are suffering the consequences of those pollutions. So it connects the polluter in an individual sense with the victim in an individual sense across the planet. And therefore, if we accept that statement of the problem, then the solution is each one of us has a role to play. We need to look at our own carbon footprint, how we can reduce that. If it happens to be higher than the global average, then we have a responsibility to the victims of our pollution, because they are human beings on another side of the planet who are going to be affected by my lifestyle wherever I happen to be.
Dr. Mitchell, last question. Last one or two big issues.
Well, I think we have one big problem that needs solving actually right now, and that's that the amount of money spent on subsidising fossil fuels, the coal, the oil and gas that we consume, is greater than the amount of money we spend on tackling climate change. And that seems to be really perverse when we can have no ice left in the Arctic. And I think for me, in terms of actually striking a new political deal, we have the opportunity in 2015 to agree a new climate change deal, to agree a new development deal, and make sure that they both speak to each other in a way that Dr. Huq outlines, in that everybody is part of the problem and everybody is part of the solution, and we need to spell that out and all work together.
We'll have to leave it there. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'm sure you'll agree it's been a compelling discussion, and I'd like to thank all our participants for their contributions today. Thank you for watching the debate.